I grew up in an environment that was directly influenced by a multi-party affiliation. To understand why, my father, Anthony Frampton, ran for the Dominica Labour Party, was politically victimized by the Freedom Party. He later ran again at a later age for the United Workers' Party. I received my first scholarship under the Dominica Freedom Party. I'm a Dominican. Party has very little relevance to me. I wanted to say that so you can understand where I'm coming from. Today, if you are anticipating an impassioned takedown of Roosevelt's carrot, I'm going to disappoint you. Hey, make no mistake. I still believe Dominica urgently needs a change of government. And the best hope of constitutionally achieving this is to support the United Workers' Party candidates at the upcoming general election. But since we have been inundated with political vitriol from both sides, I would like to begin a more contextual, sober, and rational conversation about the reasons why we need a change of government and the reasons why we need to change the course of governance in Dominica. For the next half hour or so, I will explore how our system of government supports our underdevelopment. I will propose some considerations for exploring a more progressive form of government. I will suggest how apathy towards corruption creates long-term problems. And I will look at a few ways in which we can reconsider citizenship in a way that facilitates a more progressive model of social responsibility. So what is the state of politics and economics in Dominica now? I think there's a general feeling that we are a very divided nation. Yes? No?
Yes.
That partisan politics trumps national interests. And I mean trumps in a Trumpian sense.
Yes.
That there is a them and us approach to debating national issues, right? That there is an underlying reservation or fear among many residents to openly participate in direct political action that critiques or opposes the incumbent government. Yes? No?
Yes.
And then there are more structured problems. We have a serious problem of outward migration. And by the way, the irony is not lost on me considering that I'm saying this in the context of this particular forum. Our Eastern Caribbean Currency Union countries do not have such an acute migration problem. Between 1980 and 2014, our population decreased while theirs increased. The thing is, we have the highest natural rate of population growth in the sub-region, which is around 2% a year. But our outward migration is what is above the charts. And most of the people who are leaving are the highly skilled ones, and they account to around 80% of our skilled labor force. This is a serious problem. We also have a serious unemployment problem. Our unemployment to population ratio is nearly 30%, which is the lowest in the sub-region. And for those of you who don't know, the higher your population, your unemployment to population ratio is, the better your index. For example, Iceland, which is considered one of the most progressive countries in the world, has a population index of 81%. Ours the lowest in the sub-region. And we are also lower than 45% of Latin American and low to middle income countries in the world. This is where the debate has to be. Then there's a heavy dependence on government for employment. The government of Dominica employs some 20% of our compatriots by. Where is the private sector? Let's leave out the private sector debate for a while because that's an easy debate. I just want to bring in some of the things that I would like to see being considered in conversations about where we go from here. We are very vulnerable to natural disasters and are still recoiling from both Erica and Maria. Like you know, on August 27, 2015, Hurricane Erica wreaked havoc on our country, causing damage in the amount of 96% of our GDP. On September 18, 2017, Hurricane Maria devastated Dominica, leaving behind some $1.3 billion in damage. Do you know how much, what percentage of our GDP is? That is 226% of our GDP. We can't afford to fool around if we want to save our country. We have to get serious. You would think that that type of vulnerability to natural disasters, that we would focus on a tight fiscal management of public funds and a very comprehensive restructuring of our national priorities and our approach to governance. Well, none of these has happened. In fact, we are getting more wasteful, more short-sighted, more negligent, and more irresponsible with public resources. In the interest of time, I will forego details of some of these, since they have dominated a lot of the opposition narrative surrounding governance, and I'm sure you're aware of some of them. Because there's some important points I want to make, and I don't want to take up all evening. But most disheartening, what breaks my heart most about Dominica right now, both as a scholar and as a community worker, there is a very unhealthy tolerance to public corruption that is taking over our country. It has become a plague in our country. And by public corruption, I mean specifically any action or engagement by public officers that abuse public office for personal or partisan gain. For instance, political interference in the payment of contracts, which by the way cost us millions of dollars in lost value and lost opportunities to develop local business and local capacity. If politicians in public office direct public resources to their constituency, cronies, or supporters, instead of giving them to the village, community, or people most in need, they are corrupt. If every deserving Dominican does not have a fair chance of receiving public assistance, then the government is corrupt. If politicians are acquiring unexplained personal wealth while in public office without the proper intervention of the government's accountability systems, they are corrupt and our system is corrupt. Simple as that. If politicians in public office delay national investment programs for blitz, fragmented and short-sighted infrastructural projects to bedazzle the electorate during impending national elections, they are corrupt. If the government uses the police to selectively prosecute crimes, especially when they have political overtones, then it is corrupt. And you know what? This is not even in my script, but I want to pause and say publicly that this full litigation against the leader of the opposition and a few of his opposition colleagues is not only a serious blow to how we've traditionally run our country, but is a serious blow to justice, the freedom of speech, and our ability to keep checks and balances on our government in the Western Community. This is a new development, and this particular development can directly be traced to the National Security Administration. The others that I mentioned, they did not begin under the Roosevelt Security Administration, but under its stewardship, these practices have become brazen, normalized, expected, and even a national mantra. Let's take the housing program, for example. I'm going to skip the Kalinago housing project, not just because it is quite obvious what transpired, but also because it has been very effectively lobbied and articulated by the Kalinago people, and no reasonable Dominican can ignore or deny this travesty. Of course, it is a good thing when a government provides affordable housing for its citizens, but when the primary purpose of such projects is political expediency, they create long-lasting social, economic, and spatial problems that will eventually cost the country lots more to correct or keep under control. And there are examples around in the Caribbean for us to look at. Take, for example, Operation Pride in Jamaica, launched by then Prime Minister P.J. Patterson to provide proper housing for the poor in Kingston. A noble and progressive project was transformed into a corrupt cesspool because partisan interest dominated its control, management, and administration. Dominica has never seen anything like this before, not on this scale, not to this magnitude. And yes, I'm including the political events that led to the U-29, 1979, and the rest. What happened with Operation Pride in Jamaica is happening in Dominica in a different form. Perhaps the most disturbing inflection of Dominica's current political climate, as I said, is the apathy of public corruption. There seems to be no longer any shame in stealing government's money. True. I have heard otherwise lucid Dominicans say, so what if they take money? Yes. Everybody does it. And what makes the struggle against this national cancer so complicated is that the significant section of the electorate has been conditioned through deliberate propaganda to remember and even relive anxieties over mild acts that tainted the UWP's short term in office. Make no mistake, there's a trend, but what is going on is a struggle. And if you're patriotic enough, brave enough, or ethically grounded enough to call them out, they will tell you, cool out. Dominica seems to be ready to cool out right now. You know, but it makes sense. It makes sense. After getting people drunk on too much cold red Kool-Aid in a heated environment, you ought to expect them to want to cool out. The problem is, that type of cool-out creates cross-generational problems. They may cost millions and maybe even lives to get under control. Take the case of Jamaica, for example. The corruption in the awards of contracts during the building of schools in the Loan for Education program of 1966 was a major catalyst to a trend that has led the country to debt of over $1.7 trillion. Historian and author Arnold Bertram notes, if these monies had all been spent in a way to get value for money, not only would Jamaica be fully developed, but Jamaica would be able to export capital and assist other countries to develop as well. Does that ring a bell for what is going on in Dominica with our citizen by investment program? Again, I'm just trying to get you to think beyond just party colors. What crime and corruption caused Jamaica over the last 40 years is equal to 90% of its total public debt. Does that ring a bell for what is going on in Dominica?
Yes.
Now imagine the kind of country Jamaica would have been had it addressed these problems when it had the opportunities to do so. We have an opportunity to address this problem at the upcoming general election. And not just one simple response for all the pretentious Dominicans who ask for evidence whenever the media, opposition activists, or political pundits present convincing arguments or analyses that highlight the corruption of the Roosevelt-Skerrit administration. Why hasn't there been a single public inquiry into any of these convincing allegations of corruption? Why? Why not one? You know, there was a time when our government would agree to public demands for formal inquiries into issues of national importance, even when they were implicated in these inquiries. What has happened to us? For those of you too young to remember Dominica before the age of DNO and Facebook, just go to the National Documentation Center and say Dr. Frampton asked you to look for file number 00901DM. And you can read about the Commonwealth of Dominica report of the Commission of Inquiry into allegations made by Derek Gonzalez and Edison James of a plot to bug the headquarters of the United Workers' Party. This was under Freedom Party administration. What happened to us? And surprisingly, some of the same Freedomites who were involved in getting this executed are those now who are blocking the inquiry into corruption and public office. The truth is, and I want you to listen to me very carefully, I repeat, the truth is, there can hardly be a more resounding death knell to the prosperity of a democratic country than voters who shrug their shoulders at public corruption and social and economic injustice, perpetrated by those given the privilege to manage the collective resources of the state and the power to maintain social order. And if you think corruption is just a temporary thing that we can get over quite easily, corruption is quite costly and takes a very long time to get under control. Yes, Dominica is making a lot of money from the Citizen by Investment program. Estimates are close to 5% of GDP, or perhaps more clearly 16% of total revenues of the government's budget. The IMF warns that this heavy reliance on CBI revenue is very unhealthy because of the very real threat that it could end suddenly. Most of the accounted CBI funds that have been reported have been used for post-Erica and post-Maria reconstruction and other infrastructure projects. An interesting fact though, something that I just find quite interesting, is that for the 2015-2016 financial year, the government of Dominica reported spending 2.4% of GDP on promotion, marketing, and due diligence of the Citizen by Investment program. That's a lot of money. How was that money spent? Why aren't details of that made public? The major reason given by government sources that such disclosures would undermine the program is unreasonable and unacceptable. Surely the appropriate reductions could be made without withholding the necessary public interest information. The government's argument is akin to the Republican argument that the Mueller report should not be published because it undermines national security. Well, it was eventually published, wasn't it? Some insiders believe that we are making lots more from the sale of diplomatic passports, which go unreported and unaccounted. And because these monies escape proper financial review, they are not incorporated into our economic matrices, nor measured against indices used to calculate our national performance. And so we keep borrowing and borrowing to meet our needs. Here's where we get the second thing that is bothering me about Dominica. Today, our country is heavily indebted. I don't think the average Dominican realizes how much. Dominica's debt is above 70% of GDP, which puts us in the red zone, pun intended. Note, for some of you who may not be aware of this economic formulas, note that a good debt to GDP ratio is usually considered around the 60% mark. Here's what the IMF thinks, and I quote: the large debt level and the significant risk to the debt sustainability outlook merits the classification of Dominica as high risk of external debt distress. We are heavily indebted to one of the most rigid lenders, who makes no bones about its economic colonization model of global expansion. Our government has taken a loan of $40 million from the Export-Import Bank of China for infrastructural projects and education, which is 11% of our GDP. There is no consultation or transparency, but we have to keep asking questions because our children will be the ones paying that loan back.
Yes.
When the government follows this up with consideration of another $60 million loan, which is 16% of our GDP, to construct a murky tourism resort, we have to be very concerned about its decision-making and our debt outlook. Ironically, the aggressive lending practices of the United Workers' Party in the past that the DLP relentlessly chastised pales compared to these types of reckless borrowing. And this is what we know about. The tacit consensus is that there's a lot more that we don't know about. And throughout all this, we allow our government, our Prime Minister, our Ministers of Cabinet to escape public scrutiny by independent trained professionals. We say it is okay for a Prime Minister to behave not transparent. He continually leaves the country and we do not know where he is. He binds us and our children into legal obligations and we have no idea what any of it is about. We ask questions and we clap and laugh when he tells us to go to hell. We do not make him uncomfortable about only talking to local media who are sycophantic and loyal, so he avoids those who would ask him the hard questions. Even when local researchers, professionals, and activists make a good faith request for information that ought to be in the public domain, they are ignored or brushed aside. Frankly, this is something that I want you to consider. After reviewing some of the small island developing states and the models of governance, and I'm not only referring to the Caribbean, but some of the Pacific Islands as Tuvalu and some of them. To me, it's unacceptable that Dominica does not have an Access to Information Act that gives citizens the legal right to acquire official government information that is not exempted reasonably as standard practice as standard practice in an advanced democracy. We often lament the poor quality of public discourse in the media, but I submit to you that one of the major reasons for this is the lack of proper, credible information. The other, of course, is our attitude to media, not only the people on the media, but our attitude to procuring and supporting our media institutions. But that's for another discussion. Interestingly, every single IMF Article 4 consultation report on Dominica from 2005 to 2018, and I went through every one of them, lamented the insufficiency of valuable data that are important for analyzing the economic health of the country. And each of these reports exposed the need for us to upgrade the agencies and institutions responsible for generating information that is useful to directing development programs. This is not largely an issue of money. This is mostly about a way of doing things. A view of government that is heavily embedded in a post-colonial mentality. An attitude to information in an information age that is sure to leave us lagging behind. I mean, has the public library been renovated? I rest my case. As the IMF's 2007 Article 4 report states, and I quote, comprehensive, reliable, and timely data are essential for policy analysis, effective policy making, and informed public debates. Yet, we do nothing about it. So why does this happen? Why do we allow this? What about our system that permits that type of malfeasance, abuse, and graft? The fact is that our system of government allows for a concentration of power. As we have seen, it allows a government that dominates parliament to constrain civil liberties and undermine the public good. In such cases, our constitution hardly provides cover for devolved institutions or agencies. The Westminster model depends too heavily on conventions and antiquated arguments of common law to provide guidance on governance. What exactly is the Westminster model? The Westminster model is a parliamentary legislative system of government created largely from the structure, practices, and processes of the Parliament of the United Kingdom based in the Palace of Westminster. This is the model that our government system was modeled after. Most Commonwealth and ex-Commonwealth nations have some variant of it. Under the system, we have a head of state, which in Dominica is the president of Dominica. Although this position is theoretically quite powerful, it is practically a ceremonial position. Since the real and enormous power under the Westminster model resides in the head of government, not in the head of state, which is the office of the Prime Minister, who traditionally wields ultimate control over cabinet, which comprises the most senior members of the executive branch, which we typically call ministers of government. The Prime Minister has such tremendous power that he can decide who he appoints to cabinet, and he can decide when and how to fire them. And you know what? He even decides who the head of state is through parliament. Shows majority control of parliament. Worse, in our system, the Prime Minister also typically serves as the leader of the majority party, which gives him or her extensive power in deciding the party's candidates for national elections. Why is that important? Well, listen. Since historically we have tended to have professional politicians, and by that I mean persons who have made a career out of political representation, we are talking about the Prime Minister's control over these politicians' livelihood. What then are the chances that they will challenge him in any profound way when duty demands it? What do you think are the chances? We must begin to shape a Dominica that devolves governmental power in a way that more appropriately represents our realities as a small island developing state and is more conducive to our national development. We ought to consider changes to our constitution and system of government that reduces the Prime Ministerial Office's extensive power to control almost all aspects of political and social life in the country. Although the Westminster model makes it theoretically possible for a government to be dismissed by a no-confidence motion and also permits for the dissolution of Parliament and for new elections, this no-confidence motion and dissolution of Parliament hardly ever happens due to how power is constituted. While we have been rightfully paying close attention to constitutionalities and government action, we have been giving inadequate attention to the conventions that facilitate government incompetence, malfeasance, and abuse. And by conventions, I refer to the ways we have run our country from the time of its independence that have made certain behaviors and practices seem normal. Arguably, conventions more than constitutional dictates are the foundation on which our system of government is based. Admittedly, while we have codified quite a bit of these conventions into law, most are malleable arrangements, rules or procedures that rely on an ethical and moral compass for application and interpretation. Professor Peter Rene observed about the Westminster model that as the head of the ruling party, the Prime Minister and his cabinet of ministers are the government. The electorate's difference to party leadership, the pressures of globalization and the crude evolution of global capitalism have led to unprecedented government corruption, extrajudicial enactments of executive powers, and the breakdown of local government. The Westminster model that we have in Dominica was never set up to facilitate our progress, certainly not our progressive development. It was primarily meant to facilitate a more formal, not meaningful, just formal, decolonization and ensure the stability of former colonies without the direct control or responsibility of the British Crown. The former colonies were no longer subjects of the Crown, but the laws, foundations, and symbols that they retained meant that they would continue to be subjected to the Crown. It was this fusion of national independence and a colonial system of government shrouded by the Westminster framework that created the polarizing two-party system that we have, making it difficult for a multi-party system to flourish. I know we have three parties, but I say flourish, because arguably it is the three-party system that we have now that has facilitated the current abuse of government. Yet the region continues to score high in the democracy indices of international watchdog organizations. As Kobeta and Vinandamu noted in a paper titled Westminster and Small States, comparing the Caribbean and Pacific experience, while Freedom House is an agency that ranks democracy in countries around the world, while Freedom House ranks these countries highly, they do not meet the standards of a sustainable democracy. The assessment models legitimately capture the prevalence of heated public debate that is an unmistakable part of Caribbean culture. What they miss are the subtle and insidious ways in which democracy remains smothered by political action. They underestimate the effect of the entrenched culture of electoral corruption, most acutely articulated by the incumbents' abuse of state resources for party mobilization, voter intimidation, and alienation of opposition parties. They undervalue the meaning and implications of OECS governments pushing through a broadcast authority bill instead of or alongside an Access to Information Act. Some of us may remember debates of the Draft Broadcasting Authority Act for Dominica, proposed some 10 years ago. They need to ask themselves why the English-speaking Caribbean remains one of the few democratic territories yet to pass effective legislation to regulate the financing of national elections. They seem unable to appreciate the effects of victimization, clientelism, and intimidation on the political culture in these territories. They must ask themselves why so many resident Dominicans are unhappy with their governance, but few will ever openly attend the protest. Even our learned compatriot, Dr. Donald Peters, who is now a staunch supporter of the current regime, warned us in 1992 of the effects of clientelism, victimization, and patronage on Eastern Caribbean democracies in his often cited text, The Democratic System in the Eastern Caribbean. Then, as a darling of Virginia Charles, Dr. Peters was a strong proponent of public accountability and good governance. But I wonder if now, as an ally of Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerritt, Dr. Peters still believes or stands by his insightful treatise. The point is not to pick on him, of course, but to highlight a powerful metaphor that exposes the radical transformation of political conscience in favor of tangible individual interest that has led our country towards a deadly precipice, which many of us who love our homeland are determined to avert. The Westminster model does not function well in an environment of intense partisan polarization, and that is what we have today. Public institutions like the security services, the civil service, the electoral commission, and the judiciary are supposed to function impartially instead of becoming weapons of insular partisan battles, in which, of course, the incumbent has a grossly unfair advantage. We must disabuse ourselves of the idea that government will be fair without strong monitoring, regulations, and evaluation. Without these safeguards, genuine and necessary welfare programs and justifiable government assistance are easily co-opted to mobilize partisan support. Our society's increased neglect of civics, not only as a subject of study, but as a culture and a way of life to be nurtured by all the different institutions of socialization in Dominica, is one of the reasons that we seem caught in this whirlpool of national despair and dysfunction. Admittedly, this decay did not start under the Dominica Labour Party, but it was manifestly accelerated at an alarmingly quick rate and by a new model of populist leadership that could not survive with a woke and patriotic electorate. And by the term civics, I mean significant issues or actions that involve the nation as a community and that prioritizes the welfare of citizens. Our schools, our religious bodies, our service organizations, and even our families have mostly failed to emphasize and advance civic principles and knowledge. Our schools and curricula from elementary to tertiary levels prepare students for certification and exams, not for citizenship, individual empowerment, and national development. Furthermore, we must push our churches to embrace righteousness as a lived experience, not as a religious code or biblical reference to regurgitate. That's why, despite not being deeply religious, I still appreciate the reflections of local clergy like Pastor Rodney and Reverend Wharton. I miss the wisdom and honesty of theologians like Father Jordan.
Yes.
And I look forward to another public debate from Dr. Frampton. I want to be clear. We must not confuse cultural preservation with patriotism and civic duty. They are not the same. In some cases, they are even counterintuitive. Wearing traditional wear, fronting paraphernalia with national symbols, or participating in cultural festivals do not inherently make you civic-minded or patriotic.
Very true. Very true.
They may make you nationalistic or sentimental, but not necessarily patriotic. Also, going home every year for the World Korean Music Festival does not necessarily qualify. I'd like to propose to you 4 basic reasons why we should make civics a mandatory part of national education and cultural awareness. 1, civics makes people aware of how the government works. 2, it makes citizens aware of their rights and the procedures and avenues for lawfully owning their government. It teaches them about the true value of their vote.
Yes.
It teaches people about the limitations of government and how they can keep them in check, not only at national development, at national elections, but year-round. We must give as much attention to inculcating social responsibility to the Dominican citizenry as we give to economic models and fiscal strategies. This is how all the most accomplished countries were built. And I use the term social responsibility here to mean the belief system that citizens ought to honor their civic duty. The idea that individual interests and action ought not to supersede the interests of the wider society or the national community. The idea that a vote ought not to be bought. Social responsibility does not simply celebrate economic growth, but views economic development in relation to the welfare of citizens and the preservation of the environment. It is built on a solid system of ethics that considers any action that is harmful to society or the environment as socially irresponsible. It creates a clear distinction between right and wrong. I would also like to advocate for a more progressive and independent role for our courts in our system of government. I argue that our system of appointing judges and the traditional role of our judicial system as the enforcers and elaborators and the protector of specific rights are too limited for our realities as a small island developing nation. It may be useful to review the role of the judiciary as elaborators and enforcers of rules and laws to independent arbitrators that permit their timely input in critical matters of governance. While we must retain certain aspects of the decentralized role of the justice system, we must make our courts more efficient and competent in facilitating public engagement and influencing public accountability and transparency in ways that are not just litigious. We ought to see them as critical actors in ensuring that government works as much during the fact as after the fact. For instance, we can create a more pivotal role for the courts and governance by ensuring that those affected by government action are reasonably consulted and allowed a fair role in participating in decisions that affect them. I know this may sound controversial to some of you, but if societies keep evolving, we must consider whether our judicial system has evolved sufficiently to address the threats that we face as a small island state in this modern era. And we must consider this not only in terms of the structure of the courts, as with the CCJ, but also in the substance of its deliberations and its relationship with other institutions of court. In closing, I do not present this survey as this talk as a survey of Dominica's political or economic health. Neither am I making any claims of it being a thorough review of the most pressing issues facing the country. I have presented you with my thoughts on some critical aspects of governance, civics, and social responsibility about Dominica and possible perspectives for exploring them. I've argued for an urgent and deliberate review of our Westminster model. I've highlighted the cost of tolerating corruption, the value of a citizenry grounded in civics, and I have pointed out how the economic decisions of the last 20 years have shaped a disturbing direction of our beloved country that should concern us all. I do hope at the least that my arguments will encourage conversations that will prioritize the long-term interests of Dominica above party affiliation or short-term, short-sighted individual interests, adding a different tenor and tone to the public discourse. I have spoken in the service of Dominica and my fellow citizens. Thank you.